People who have seen them say they aren't trophies or souvenirs. They're keepsakes from a friendship built through decades of competition and mutual respect. But perhaps the most haunting object in that room tells a story of Richard's own survival. Resting inside is reportedly the damaged frame from Richard Petty's terrifying crash at Pocono Raceway in 1980. During that accident, his car flipped violently through the air before finally coming to rest after multiple barrel rolls. It was the kind of crash that has ended many racing careers and many lives. Somehow, Petty climbed out. Instead of repairing or displaying the twisted frame, he simply kept it exactly as rescue crews left it. It hasn't been cleaned or restored. He has never publicly explained why he saved it. Those who have stood beside it say no explanation is needed. Seeing it is enough. But despite all these priceless memories, people have continued trying to buy them. Experts believe everything inside the private garage could easily be worth $10 million or more. That estimate includes race cars, handwritten setup notes, pit records from championship seasons, racing equipment, and deeply personal memorabilia. Wealthy collectors have approached Richard Petty. Museums have expressed interest in displaying portions of the collection. Serious offers have been made over the years. Every single one has been rejected. For Richard, these weren't investments waiting for the right buyer. They were pieces of a life that couldn't simply be replaced. But what's remarkable is when many of those offers arrived. During the later years of Petty Enterprises, finances became increasingly difficult. NASCAR was changing. Costs climbed rapidly, and family-owned teams struggled to compete with larger organizations backed by major corporations. Richard sought outside investment and eventually transformed the business into Petty's Garage, focusing on custom vehicles and restoration work. During those challenging years, selling even part of his private collection could have provided enormous financial relief. Auction houses knew it. Collectors knew it. Yet Richard never touched it. The garage remained off limits, no matter how difficult things became. So why share some history while keeping the rest hidden? The public can visit the Petty Museum, first established by Richard's late wife, Linda, in 1988 before returning to the Level Cross property in 2014. There, visitors can admire championship cars, trophies, racing uniforms, and carefully preserved displays celebrating one of NASCAR's greatest families. It's an impressive collection and an important part of racing history. But Richard has always made one thing clear. The museum contains what he's willing to share. The private garage contains what he's chosen to keep. That difference reveals far more about the man than any trophy ever could. And nowhere is that more obvious than within his own family. Richard has often explained that some memories simply aren't meant for public display. His son Kyle Petty understands that better than anyone. Kyle raced professionally for more than 20 years and spent countless hours inside the garage growing up. He rarely talks about what remains there because to him, those aren't museum pieces. They're family memories. Richard's grandson, Thad Moffitt, has also spent time inside the building. For the Petty family, the garage functions less like a collection and more like a family room filled with decades of shared history. But one heartbreaking event changed what that place meant forever. In May 2000, tragedy struck the Petty family when Adam Petty, Kyle's 20-year-old son and Richard's grandson, died during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway after his throttle stuck. Adam had become the fourth generation of Pettys to race professionally, carrying enormous promise before his life was suddenly cut short. Kyle has said losing his son completely changed the way he viewed the family's legacy. Richard has spoken about Adam only sparingly, choosing each word carefully. After that loss, the private garage became even more personal. Opening it to collectors or turning it into another attraction simply no longer mattered. But what does that building represent today? The garage remains a quiet place where tools once used by Lee Petty still hang in familiar places. It's where damaged race cars remind the family how dangerous the sport has always been. It's where 4 generations of NASCAR history sit together under one roof, not because they're valuable, but because they're connected to the people who built them. Visitors driving through Level Cross might never realize what stands behind those walls. Yet inside, one family's entire racing legacy waits in silence. And Richard Petty himself still returns there. Richard turned 86 in 2024, but he continues spending time around the Level Cross property. Fans who meet him consistently describe him as friendly, patient, and genuinely interested in the people who travel to see him. His trademark cowboy hat and dark sunglasses remain as recognizable as ever. Meanwhile, Petty's Garage continues restoring and building custom vehicles while preserving the craftsmanship that made the family famous. Maurice Petty and Dale Inman even helped recreate the 1964 Plymouth Belvedere Championship car using original specifications and decades of first-hand experience. For them, it wasn't nostalgia. It was simply continuing the work they had always done. And that may be the biggest lesson hidden inside the garage. Most sports legends leave behind trophies, highlight reels, and record books for the public to admire. Richard Petty certainly has all of those. But the items that mattered most to him never ended up under bright lights. Instead, they stayed inside a quiet building in Level Cross, protected not because of their price, but because of what they meant to the people who lived those moments together. Legacy, for Richard Petty, was never something to auction or display. It was something to protect. And if that garage door is ever open to the world, perhaps we'll finally understand that becoming the greatest NASCAR driver of all time came with a personal cost that no amount of money could ever measure. Somewhere in Level Cross, North Carolina, there is a garage that almost nobody has ever seen. It has never been open to the public. Not for money. Not for television. Not even for collectors willing to pay incredible sums just to step inside. Richard Petty has turned them all away. Behind those closed doors are somewhere between 15 and 20 race cars, stacked on top of one another, along with personal artifacts that have never appeared in a museum. But the biggest mystery isn't what those items are worth. It's why the greatest driver in NASCAR history has spent decades keeping them hidden. What could be so important that even millions of dollars couldn't tempt him to let it go? To understand that answer, you first have to understand the man. Richard Petty didn't just have a successful career. He built one of the most dominant records in all of sports. Between 1958 and 1992, he won an astonishing 200 NASCAR Cup Series races. The next closest driver, David Pearson, finished with 105. Petty nearly doubled that total. He also captured 7 Cup Series championships, 7 Daytona 500 victories, and 123 pole positions. He made 513 consecutive starts between 1971 and 1989 and competed in 1,184 races over 35 years. These aren't records that anyone expects to break anymore. They've become part of NASCAR history itself. But where did all the pieces of that incredible journey end up? The answer leads back to Level Cross. Richard's father, Lee Petty, founded Petty Enterprises there in 1949. It quickly became the most successful family team NASCAR had ever seen. Lee won 3 championships before handing the famous number 43 car to his son. Richard's brother Maurice built the powerful engines behind many of those victories, while cousin Dale Inman called the strategy as crew chief through much of Richard's career. Remarkably, all 4 men from the same small North Carolina community eventually entered the NASCAR Hall of Fame. The buildings where they built those legendary race cars are still standing today. And at the center of it all sits the private garage that almost nobody has been allowed to enter. So what exactly is hidden inside? Richard Petty has admitted that during his racing days, nobody thought old race cars would ever become valuable. In the 1960s and 1970s, once a season ended, yesterday's winning cars simply became yesterday's equipment. Teams needed money for the next race, so old cars were sold, stripped for parts, or left behind. Petty even sold several cars to racers on the West Coast for whatever price he could get. At the time, nobody imagined collectors would one day pay enormous amounts for those same machines. Looking back, Petty has openly admitted they never thought about preserving history because they were too busy making it. But what happened to the cars that never left? Some simply stayed where they were. Richard estimates that 15 to 20 old race cars ended up piled together near the garage in Level Cross. They weren't restored. They weren't displayed. They weren't even carefully stored. They sat exposed to North Carolina, weather for decades. To racing historians, those forgotten machines represent priceless pieces of NASCAR's past. Petty himself has acknowledged that many important cars were lost forever because nobody understood their future significance. The cars that remained inside the garage survived for a completely different reason. They weren't saved because they might become valuable. They were saved because they carried memories that money could never replace. And one car tells that story better than any other. One of the most famous vehicles inside the garage is the legendary Plymouth Superbird. Introduced for the 1970 season, it was built with one goal in mind: speed. Its pointed nose and towering rear wing weren't created to look unusual. They were carefully engineered to cut through the air and keep the car stable at nearly 200 miles per hour. Behind the wheel of Plymouth race cars that season, Richard Petty won 18 races, forever linking the Superbird with the iconic number 43. Yet the one sitting in his garage hasn't been polished into a museum showpiece. Tire marks still cling underneath. Scratches and dents from real competition remain untouched. It looks exactly as it did after years of racing. But another car nearby may actually mean even more to Petty himself. That second car couldn't be more different. It's a humble 1957 Oldsmobile that Lee Petty and his sons built by hand in the family garage. It was the car Richard drove in his very first NASCAR race. Compared to the sleek Superbird, it's rough, rusty, and simple. But that's exactly why it matters. The Superbird represents the height of Richard Petty's career. The old Oldsmobile represents the beginning, when a young man from a tiny North Carolina town first discovered he belonged on a racetrack. Both cars remain in the same garage today. Neither has ever been offered for sale. But the vehicles aren't the only treasures hidden behind those walls. Deep inside the building is another room that very few outsiders have ever entered. Former Petty Enterprises employees have mentioned it over the years, describing it as a place where deeply personal items were quietly stored away. It isn't part of any public tour. It doesn't appear in museum displays. According to those familiar with it, this room holds objects that meant too much to ever place behind glass. But what could be so personal that Richard Petty chose to hide it from the public for decades? Among the items are boxes filled with fan letters dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. Many were never even opened. Richard didn't keep them because he planned to answer every letter. He kept them because throwing them away never felt right. Children wrote to him. Veterans shared their stories. Ordinary people explained how watching him race helped them through difficult times. Rather than discard those handwritten messages, he quietly saved them. They became reminders that his victories meant something far beyond the racetrack. But another collection inside that room carries an even heavier emotional weight. Richard also kept personal items connected to Dale Earnhardt Sr. Although they spent years competing against each other, the two champions developed enormous respect. Their personalities couldn't have been more different, yet they understood each other in ways few others could. After Earnhardt's fatal crash during the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Richard quietly preserved several items connected to his longtime rival.